Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ryan Bijan, host of Cowtown Movie Classics, and the theme of the week is holiday heists. And I cannot think of a better film than this very suspenseful, very unique thriller from England's Hammer Films. From 1961, starring Peter Cushing and Andre Morrell, it's Cash on Demand. Tonight's guest is a very special one. He is a very prolific film historian and author of the book English Gothic, A Century of Horror Cinema. Please welcome Mr. Jonathan Rigby. How are you doing tonight, Jonathan?
I'm very well. All the better for talking about this marvelous little film.
Yes, it's certainly a unique one. Now, of course, our regulars in the audience, if you've come to Cowtown Movie Classics, you probably best know Hammer Films as a studio whose signature was these beautiful, lavish Technicolor Gothic horror films in the 1950s and 60s. Where does Cash on Demand fit in within the Hammer pantheon?
Well, in a way, they made it in 1961. It was a bit
Mhm.
of a throwback to the very small scale black and white thrillers that they used to make in the 50s before the big Gothic boom started up for them. As you say, those films were lavish and colorful and very transgressive very often and caused a huge stir among critics. Whereas Cash on Demand is a very small subject. It also harks back to their earlier output because it's based on a television play. And of course, one of their really very innovative things that they did in the early 50s was to initially go for radio plays, curiously enough, turning them into films, radio serials, turning them into films. And then, of course, they moved on to television plays, and they had a huge hit in that regard by adapting the Quatermass Experiment, which really was their first horror film. So in many ways, Cash on Demand harks back to an earlier time for Hammer, but it's really a film where everything went right. I mean, as I say, it's a small scale film, but what's the phrase? Small but perfectly formed. It is absolutely perfect and beautifully acted and beautifully directed, very cleverly written.
It was directed by a gentleman by the name of Quentin Lawrence, and I looked at his filmography. It seems like he wasn't terribly prolific, but he does such a wonderful job with this particular film.
He certainly does. He'd started out as I believe as a nuclear physicist.
Wow.
And, yeah, and I think he had some quite deep thoughts about the fact that scientists are as much artists as anybody else. So the fact that he then went into the arts by becoming a television director initially and then a film director, he felt was perfectly natural. And he did make he made a science fiction serial in the late 50s called The Trollenberg Terror, and then was enlisted to make the film version of that. But I think he was the perfect man for this job. He was familiar with the subject because, in fact, he had directed the original television play that Cash on Demand was based on.
Hmm.
That was called The Gold Inside. That's a much more, I think the title The Gold Inside sort of tips you off a bit more than Cash on Demand does to the fact that there's a kind of allegorical side to this film in a way.
Sure.
The gold inside what? Not just inside the bank, but inside potentially inside human beings. And so anyway, Quentin Lawrence had directed the TV original, so he's very familiar with it, and he's got a very small budget. I think it was £37,000, which was comically small even in 1961. And he has 2 weeks to make the film, and the result is one of Hammer's best films. Surprise, surprise.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, the movie stars who a lot of people would consider the face of Hammer films, certainly the face of Hammer horror, Peter Cushing. Now, how wonderful is Cushing in this film without giving too much away?
Well, Peter Cushing at this particular time was actually quite keen to get away from horror. He'd had 3 or 4 years of straight sort of saturation horror, being absolutely brilliant as Baron Frankenstein and Dr. Van Helsing and all the rest. But after a marvelous film called The Brides of Dracula, he was quite keen to get away from horror. So for a few years he tried this, and between you and me, it didn't really work. So by late '63, he was back in harness with horror. But this in a way this was Hammer sort of helping him along in that line because they obviously watched the TV play in which his part was played by a guy called Richard Warner and thought, well, he'd be perfect for this part. And also, he's acted quite frequently with Andre Morel, who
Yes.
played the same part in the TV version, whereas Cushing didn't. But if Hammer thought if we put Cushing into this, then of course naturally we can pair him up with Andre Morel again. And they had a wonderful chemistry on screen. Of course, we always think of Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, where a kind of horror pairing is concerned and classic chemistry is concerned. But Cushing and Morel were just as on it. I mean, it is absolutely marvelous watching them play off each other.
All right, wonderful. Do you have any other thoughts? What does our audience have to look forward to in the next 80 minutes or so?
They have to look forward to a very unassuming film. It's a very, very British film. Really, the characters in it couldn't have come from anywhere other than Britain, I think. Of course, it still has a universal application, but it's very, very British. It's very, very small. It's very, very unassuming, but it's also enormously suspenseful and brilliantly acted, and just works absolutely perfectly within its own sort of parameters. And it's a one, of course, and above all, it's a wonderful character study.
Well, Jonathan, thank you so much. If you're in the audience, please stick around after the film so you can hear the rest of our conversation. Without further ado, from 1961, Cash on Demand. Wow, like you said, that movie's certainly small but impactful.
That's a good description. Yeah, that's a good
Yeah.
description.
So no, I like that you bring up the Andre Morel, Peter Cushing dynamic because as a Hammer fan, I know them best as Sherlock Holmes and Watson in The Hound of the Baskervilles.
Well, that's interesting because they made that film in 1958,
Mhm.
and they were very much an ideal pairing as Holmes and Watson. They may well be my favorite Holmes and my favorite Watson. So put them together, and you've got magic in that particular film. And of course, in that film, they're on the best of terms. But if you scroll back 4 years from The Hound of the Baskervilles, you get a legendary BBC play made in 1954 called 1984,
Yes.
obviously
Yeah.
based on the George Orwell novel. Now, in that, um, Cushing had been Winston Smith, and Morrell had been O'Brien, the guy who tortures Winston Smith in
Hmm.
Room 101. So, in a way, Cash on Demand was a return to the torture theme because Colonel Gore Hepburn, which is one of the great names in the history of drama, I think, Colonel Gore Hepburn is there to regenerate Harry Fordyce, to offer him redemption through a process of torture. which is actually quite a sadistic little film in certain regards. And Gore Hepburn himself, it really is. He's the most affable sadist I think Hammer ever put on film. But you know, Morrell and Cushing had that chemistry going already. I think that obviously there was a huge mutual respect between them, and and you see them there in Cash on Demand at the top of their game. And I think the interplay between them is sublime. And of course, they're such wonderfully contrasted characters. I mean, it's the basis of all drama, that kind of conflict. And I think the film embodies that beautifully.
Certainly, and I like how you mentioned that it is a redemptive arc for Fordyce's character. And in a lot of ways, this film almost feels like a contemporary restaging of A Christmas Carol, but of course without the supernatural elements.
Exactly, and Hammer were quite frank about that at the time. For such a small film, and for a film that had such difficulty getting released, by the way, they produced an enormously lavish press book for it. I think at the point that they produced the press book, they were still calling it the Gold Inside. So it literally has a gold cover, and there are and there's hundreds of pages. And they were quite frank about the fact that it was Hammer's version of A Christmas Carol, and it is very like that. I mean, obviously Harry Fordyce is Scrooge, and his subordinate, as he would call him, Pearson, is a kind of Bob Cratchit figure, and of course, Gore Hepburn is like all the ghosts, the visiting ghosts rolled into one. Um, and Gore Hepburn is a fascinating character because he seems to be as much concerned with studying human beings and, in Fordyce's case, offering him a chance of redemption. He seems to be at least as interested in that, if not more so, than in what he's there theoretically to do, which is to rob the bank. And he's actually captured with considerable ease, and he seems completely unfazed about having been captured. It just gives him the opportunity in Act Three, as it were, to torture Fordyce a little more in a slightly more, in an even more sophisticated way, by implicating him in the crime, obviously.
Mhm.
Um, but so there is no supernatural angle to the film, as you say, but there is this allegorical angle in which you wonder, who is this guy, Gore Hepburn? Because he seems to have much more on his mind than just robbing this bank. He's a strange. He's not supernatural clearly, but he's a sort of allegorical figure. Why is he there, and why is he doing this? He's obviously wanting to improve Fordyce's life. And in the process, of course, I think one of the wonderful things the film does actually is that it shows you Fordyce, and it makes it very clear that he's a horrible man when we first meet him. Absolutely awful man, really. But the film shows you that even, and particularly in a workplace environment, the absolute, if to excuse my French, but the absolute bastard who's your boss, it offers redemption even for somebody like that. It shows that there is, and here we go back to the original title of the television play, that there is gold inside potentially everyone, even someone as rebarbative, to use a posh word, as rebarbative as Fordyce is. I mean, he really is appalling. He's obviously got obsessive compulsive disorder of some kind, and there's some wonderful byplay when he's complaining about the nibs on the pens in the public part of the bank. He says this isn't a post office, which is a particularly marvelous line, and he's particularly unpleasant to Pearson. Pearson, of course, has gold inside him all along, because Pearson has been appallingly mistreated by Fordyce. But at the end, when he could throw Fordyce to the wolves, i.e. the police, he does all he can, as do all the other staff members. They do all they can to rally around and support this guy who has not made their lives very pleasant. It's actually a lovely sort of affirmative message the film gives in that way.
Mhm.
I,
Absolutely.
so yeah.
No, I was gonna say perfect,
Go
perfect for
ahead.
Christmas. No, I was gonna say perfect for the Christmas season.
Yes. Oh, it is perfect for the Christmas season. I mean, the snow in the film is fake, clearly, because it was a number of interlocking sets in Bray Studios near Windsor. The snow is fake, but I do love a snow movie, and all worthwhile Christmas films always will have a scene indoors where there's snow coming down, drifting down outside the windows. And of course, this film supplies that beautifully. And also, of course, you see Gore Hepburn driving up in his Jensen. I think it's a Jensen outside on the studio set street, and there's lovely snow there. It is a wonderful Christmas film, and exactly like A Christmas Carol. It shows that people can be redeemed. I mean, at the end, Fordyce, he's not like Scrooge in that he's not going to run out into the snow-covered streets and do an insane jig of elation and happiness, because he's just too repressed for that. But he does give a little, very Cushing-like, very bird-like little nod of thank you to the people that he's been tyrannizing just an hour or two earlier. It's beautiful in that way. I mean, redemption is the obvious theme of the film, but there's another very British theme of the film, and that is deference. And in fact, Gore Hepburn actually uses the word deference at one point. He actually says to Fordyce, a little more deference. Well, we know when you're sort of doing this play acting I've asked you to do in front of your staff members, you need to show me, Gore Hepburn, a little more deference. And the film is very funny on that score. It's an extremely British thing. There's a marvelous moment when Gore Hepburn just breezes into the bank, and Pearson goes in to say, there's this guy outside to see you, Mr. Fordyce. And Fordyce says, what sort of a man is he? And Pearson says, someone of consequence, I'd say. And of course, the whole joke of the film is that Gore Hepburn gets as far as he does merely because the British, particularly back then, the British were so used to tugging their forelocks to anyone who could just have a sufficient gravitas and have the right kind of air of command and aristocracy. And immediately people will just believe anything he says. So I think the film is actually rather a marvelous satire in that way too. And of course, because Fordyce is himself deferential to Gore Hepburn, it shows you the very shifting sands on which Fordyce's authority is founded. I mean, he isn't really in command. He's just a petty sort of martinet. And it's so easy to swat him down. It takes Gore Hepburn about 30 seconds. And in the process, you see Morrell being fantastically suave. He has some marvelous lines, as when he says, "I want bank robberies to be smoother and more sociable," which again is a wonderfully British line. And you also see Cushing doing what in many ways Cushing did best, which is going to pieces.
Mhm.
Cushing was a very nervous man. In fact, in real life, he had two or three nervous breakdowns during the course of his career, and and that fed in a very interesting and quite profound way into his acting. I think he always had a certain bird-like quality, a rather nervous, tense quality, which, when he's playing heroic characters, he can channel that into those in a different way. But when he is actually playing someone who's going to pieces, as he did in 1984 with Andre Morel previously, I mean, the results are marvelous. He actually, I think, another key point about Fordyce is that he's a robot. He's one of those human beings who behaves like a machine. He is effectively a robot, and you might, and of course Cushing puts in all these robotic ticks into Fordyce's behavior. He's constantly straightening his collar and his tie, and he also does a little semi-military sort of bounce on his heels
Mhm.
quite a lot. And he takes that to the absolute perimeter where any moment he might topple over into caricature. He just stays on the right side. And if anybody thinks, but human beings don't act like that, then I have to tell you that Cushing based the performance on somebody he'd known about 30 years earlier, his history and geography teacher, who was
Mhm.
exactly this kind of robotic man, obsessed with form and how things look and doing things right. And indeed, those very ticks, the straightening of the collar and the little military bounce, were things that he copied directly from this history and geography teacher.
Mhm.
Certainly.
Well, of course, as you know, because I know you have a background from the stage and you're an actor yourself. So, a lot of acting, it's about observing human nature, humanity, and kind of picking up these little things where you can find them.
Oh yes, absolutely. Well, I think Cushing was, like all the best actors, was, in a quiet and unassuming way, was a student of human nature and human behavior. And of course, like all actors, he had his own. He had the limitations of his physical self. He had looked a particular way. He had a very gaunt, and I keep coming back to this word, bird-like look, which determined to some degree the kind of parts he'd be cast in. Talking of which, Gothic horror, and I think he eventually realized this, Gothic horror was a real boon to him because in that milieu he could play upright, rather frightening heroes like Van Helsing, and he could also play irredeemable sociopaths like Baron Frankenstein. And he could really get his teeth into these roles. Whereas in a normal scenario, a kind of contemporary scenario, particularly in the late 50s when the angry young men were coming in, and an actor like Cushing was beginning to look a bit passé. So if he'd stayed in ordinary mainstream films, he would have been condemned, I think, to playing rather prissy civil servants,
Mhm.
or indeed bank managers. So one of the funny things about Cash on Demand is that he too, like Hammer was sort of going back to the films they'd made previously, he too was going back to the kind of parts he'd played previously. Only here, lo and behold, the bank manager was the star. I mean, how many films have bank managers as their stars? There can't be many. I don't think there are any that I can think of offhand. So here, Cushing was able to sort of mine the kind of character he'd previously played, but bring star quality to it. And
And
the results are incredible.
oh no, yeah, certainly, certainly. So as we close out this conversation, what was the reception like in 1961 when this film came out?
Well, it came out in America first. It was released just before Christmas, as you'd expect. It was made in April 1961, in a fortnight. Came out in America just before Christmas, and I think people were very aware that it was a wonderful sort of chamber piece, absolutely perfectly formed. I think they were aware that it was largely a two-man show, but they were also aware that the the other cast members were marvelous too. I mean, at the beginning of the film, before Fordyce arrives, you suddenly know these characters almost instantly, and yet they have very little screen time. Edith Sharp and Lois Dane and Norman Bird and Barry Lowe, and of course Richard Pearson, who is marvelous as the second in command of Fordyce. So people are aware that it was, beautifully directed on a very small scale, very well written, and very well cast. But it struggled to get released in Britain. It's such a British film.
Yeah.
But Hammer couldn't find, Hammer were reliant on distributors wanting to place this film as a B movie because obviously it's not going to be an A film. It's not going to be the main attraction. And it took them 2 years to do it, so it didn't come out here until just before Christmas 1963. And then, for some reason, Hammer cut it for British audiences. They took 14 minutes out of it.
Hmm.
And it's only 80 minutes as it is. So it had a slightly checkered career, and I think it became forgotten for quite a long time. But latterly, people have realised just how good it is, which is the kind of destiny it ought to have had all along.
Truly, truly. Now, for our audience, if you enjoyed our conversation, I highly recommend you check out some of Jonathan's audio commentaries of
Ah,
across many labels in the United Kingdom and in the United States. This is the Blu-ray. This is from Indicator Films of Cash on Demand. He has a wonderful commentary on there. And so, Jonathan, are you working on anything at the moment? Is there anything else we can look forward to?
oh, well, I'm working on several things. I've actually been working. The English Gothic book you mentioned is part of a trilogy, along with something called Euro Gothic and something called American Gothic. But it's about to become. I say about. I've been working on it for some time already, but it's about to become a quadrilogy. Is that the right word?
I think.
Because I'm writing something called, at the moment anyway, American Gothic 2.
Uh-oh, okay.
Equal to the previous one. The previous one only went up to 1960, and an awful lot of interesting stuff happened
Since
after.
then.
So yes, that's the main thing I'm working on at the moment.
Well, I know I'm certainly looking forward to it and completing the set. Well, once
So
again,
am I. So am I. I'm looking forward to finishing.
yeah, I can imagine. Well, Mr. Jonathan Rigby, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Ryan. It's been great.
Thank you. And for you in the audience, once again, my name is Ryan Bijan. We'll see you next time.